Hello and welcome to Quadriga. Operation Olive Branch. That is the rather ironic name that Turkey has given to the military offensive it's currently waging against Kurdish fighters in northern Syria. President Erdogan says he's simply following up on the defeat of Islamic State to finish cleansing the region of terrorists. For to Turkey, the Syrian Kurds are terrorists. But to the U.S. and its coalition partners, including Germany, they are or were allies, reliable local partners who were instrumental in defeating Islamic State. Yet the West is not exactly rushing to their rescue. Is the YPG, as the Syrian Kurd militia is known, on the verge of becoming the next victim of Middle Eastern power politics? Erdogan's offensive. Who will help the Kurds? That's our topic on Quadriga, and here are our guests. It's a pleasure to welcome Dilek Kurban back to the show. She's a legal scholar and a fellow at the Hertie School of Governance here in Berlin. And she says while the Turkish government violates international law in the name of counterterrorism, the international community is once again standing still. And it's great to have Eva Savelsberg on the program. She's from the European Center for Kurdish Studies, and she says the Syrian Kurds finally have to focus on their own political interests. The PKK, YPG, only follows its own agenda and will not help them. And we will soon be delving deeper into what those acronyms mean. And finally, it's great to have Daniel Gerlach on the show. He is the founder and editor-in-chief of Zenith, a magazine on the Islamic world. And he says no player can pretend to be surprised. The U.S., some European countries, but also Russia created a set of false expectations. And they knew that this would happen. So this is very much a case of one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist, to quote that old saying. So let me start out by asking all of you to share your views on whether, in fact, Erdogan is justified in viewing the Syrian Kurdish fighters as a terrorist threat. And I'll start out by asking you, Dilek Kurban. Turkey says that the YPG, that's the acronym that stands for this northern Syrian Kurdish militia, is associated with the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, which the US and the EU do recognize as a terrorist group. Is he right?
Well, the fact that there is an association between these two groups is a fact, in the sense that they share a certain ethnic heritage, political affiliation. Having said that, they are two separate organizations with two distinct histories and goals. For Erdogan to claim that that YPG is a terrorist threat to Turkey, he has to substantiate that. The Turkish government, has never actually provided any facts to substantiate that the YPG has engaged in acts of terrorism in Turkey or targeting Turkey, as opposed to the PKK. The PKK has done that. But as far as YPG is concerned, that's not the case. So what Erdogan is doing is that sort of, conflating these organizations and presenting them as one in order to provide a justification for his government's intervention into Syria.
Eva Savelsberg, your opening statement appears to indicate that you would agree with Erdogan in regard to the association between the YPG militia and the PKK. So would you say, in fact, YPG is a terrorist organization?
Well, what I would say is that definitely the PKK and the YPG are one and the same organization. It really doesn't make any sense to try to differentiate between them. For example, if you have a look at the leading personnel of the YPG, it's all old PKK personnel. So you can work today as a PKK cadre in Turkey, and then you're told to go to Syria, and then you're suddenly someone working for the YPG. It's also a fact that if you have a look at who is fighting in the YPG in Syria, there are reliable statistics that more than 50% or about 50% of those fighting there are actually Kurds from Turkey. So I think these 2 points show very clearly that the YPG and the PKK are really one and the same organization. And of course, I would agree with you that the YPG has not targeted Turkey or anything like this far. But of course, since it is one organization, it's of course a threat for Turkey that now they have on their border the YPG being armed by the United States. I mean, it's should be quite simple to get those weapons over to Turkey and to use them there. So insofar, I would agree that it's a danger for Turkey, even though the YPG has not yet targeted Turkey.
Meaning you would say Erdogan's offensive is legitimate. Turkey has legitimate security interests that it has a right to pursue here.
I do understand the security interests, even though there are also other things why Turkey is now intervening. But this doesn't mean that it's legal, of course.
Daniel Gerlach, other reasons why Turkey is intervening. How do you interpret Erdogan's aims here? Is he really just looking to cleanse the region of terrorism or to prevent establishment of a Kurdish state?
Both, but there is a third domestic aspect to it. I think as cynical as it sounds, a good war is always good to strengthen the leadership and the authority of a government in question, a challenged or a contested government. And I think for the Erdogan government, this operation is important in political terms. The Syria policy of Turkey was very harmful to Turkey and was very, let's say, lacking success, lacking positive outcome for the country and presenting more and more conflict and more security challenges. So this intervention for Turkey is somehow kind of deferring the attention from a broader problem in Syria and a broader domestic problem to one very focused security aspect. And he can be sure at least to declare victory to a certain extent, as long as he doesn't go deeper into Syria. And also, I think it's an attempt to unite the country. Let's not forget that the armed forces, the elements of the armed forces that were sent to Syria, not only now, but also a year ago in another operation, were suspected of participating in the coup. Were the ones, where the usual suspects when it comes to looking for the responsibles of the military coup attempt. And so he speaks to an audience which is at the same time very nationalistic, somehow also vindictive. And it provides a good chance politically to remain in the game and to somehow prove himself a legitimate ruler, a commander-in-chief.
I want to come back to some of the domestic political aspects in Turkey a bit later, but Dilek Kurban, judging from your opening statement, you do not see legitimate security interests here. You talked about counterterrorism being used as a pretext to violate international law. So you would say even if there is a YPG-PKK association, in other words, between the militia and a group recognized as a terrorist group, still Turkey shouldn't be embarking on this offensive?
Well, I mean, international law is quite clear about the use of force against another, a country's use of force against another country. Well, I shouldn't say very clear. There are contradictions there too. I mean, the law is not very settled. But what is clear is that the use of force can only be, under Article 51 of the UN Charter, it can only be justified in the name of self-defense. And when a government claims self-defense, cannot just say, well, I'm acting in self-defense. It has to substantiate that. Has to show that there are attacks, there's an armed attack, but sustained and threatening armed attack coming from the country in question. Now, in this case, when you read the notification that the Turkish government has sent to the Security Council, it's really vague. It doesn't even refer to the term armed attack, but really says, well, there's a terrorism threat. This is not enough to meet that high legal threshold to prove that there's actually an armed attack to justify self-defense. The government, what the Turkish government also said is that there are these sort of hostile missiles being shot from, by the YPG. From what we know, we don't know much, at least I don't know much, but from what we know from the news reports, those were shot actually after Turkey started its offensive. At any rate, as I said earlier, armed attack under international law really we have to talk about sustained, high-level armed attack to justify that. This is a blatant violation of international law as far as Article 51 is concerned. And the Security Council, the UN, OSCE, EU, everybody is keeping quiet about a NATO members and a UN members' violation of international law. That I find disconcerting.
Well, if only the forces on the ground cared about international law.
Sure.
And those that do and those that substantiate their arguments on international law are basically the Syrian regime and Russia. Mm-hmm. And what good that produces, I think we can judge this in a different show. Probably we don't have the time to discuss that.
We'll come back to it. Actually,
but this is the plight of international law in Syria, as demonstrated another time. Sure. And frankly, I don't think... I think the Turkish government can very well bring the argument and substantiate its claims also in legal terms by saying we are fighting against an insurgent organization in Turkey, in our own country, which is somehow present in our neighboring country and which can at least plan, if not directly attack, but plan its operations out of this country.
But that's hypothetical.
It is hypothetical, but it's very easy to make this argument, and also I think even to win it. I'm not an expert on international law as you are, but I think politically it's very easy.
Yes, but that's a different
May I
situation.
just make a cut there, because I would like to come back to the situation of the Kurds in northern Syria and delve a little bit deeper into something that you said in your opening statement, Eva Savelsberg, namely that the Syrian Kurds need to focus on their own political interests. So could you give us briefly, if you would, for those viewers who are not well acquainted with this very, very complex picture, a bit of a sense of how you see those political interests and how they might diverge, for example, from what the YPG, the militia, is looking for?
Well, I think the most important point is really to say that the YPG, as the PKK, is really focused on Turkey. For them, Turkey is the place where they come from, and Turkey is the place where they do have their followers. The Syrian Kurds, and that's a sad story in a way, for a long time they always fought for the rights of Kurds in other countries. For example, many Kurds followed the Iraqi Kurds when they fought their fights against Saddam Hussein and even before. And then many Kurds in the 1990s, many Syrian Kurds joined the PKK and fought for the Kurds in Turkey. And there was never actually, before the Syrian civil war started, a Kurdish Syrian insurgent group or something like this. Something like this simply didn't exist. And I think it's high time that the Syrian Kurds really focus on what they want to achieve in Syria, and not so much to focus on what is happening in Syria and what is happening in Iraq. The Kurds, or let's say the political parties in Iraq and in Turkey, don't do that. In the end, they are not really interested in what is happening to the Syrian Kurds. This is like that for a long time. For example, Abdullah Öcalan, when he used to be in Syria, he used to be there for a long time before he was then exiled.
Mr. Öcalan being the very charismatic Kurdish leader.
Exactly, of the PKK. And he even said there is no Kurdish problem in Syria. This is, of course, something. This was, of course, a deal with the Syrian regime. He was allowed to be there, and for that, he had to annoy that there is no Syrian Kurdish problem.
And the Syrian Kurds' political body, the Democratic Union Party, which is known by its acronym as the PYD, it actually also would reinforce that, saying it's not looking to break away. It simply wants regional autonomy inside a federal Syria. Is that true?
I'm not even sure if the PYD wants regional autonomy or something like this in Syria. I think they are just using Syria for their interests in Turkey. If you have a look, for example, back to 2014, you see that after they fought against the Islamic State, against the so-called Islamic State in Kobani, they became really popular all over the world. People said, hey, this is the only force that can fight the Islamic State. It's our only allies in Syria. So because they fought the Islamic State, the PKK suddenly seemed to be a nice group, the only ones who have women's rights, for example, the only ones who are really anti-Islamic, the only ones who are real Democrats. So they really profited politically in the international community from this fight. And this is what they're interested in. They are not interested in Syrian Kurdistan in the end. And for them, it's not important if there is autonomy or something like this. They want to profit for their fight in Turkey from what is happening in Syria.
Let's look closer at that role in that fight. We have a short report on the role that the Syrian Kurdish fighters played in the fight against IS.
For months now, Kurdish fighters have been defending the Syrian border town of Kobane against possible attacks by Islamic State forces. In early 2015, the Kurds, backed by Western airstrikes, managed to end an IS siege of the town. Kurdish fighters and local militias finally liberated the Iraqi town of Sinjar in November 2015. During the occupation, Islamic State fighters massacred several thousand civilians. In October 2017, a Syrian-based alliance led by Kurdish fighters captured the town of Raqqa, the capital of the Islamic State since 2014. The IS Caliphate has now collapsed, but Turkish forces have launched a campaign against Kurdish fighters in northern Syria. Have the Kurds been betrayed by the West?
Daniel Gerlach, your opening statement said, in essence, you do think they've been betrayed or at least led on by the U.S. coalition. Would you say that the U.S. and its allies willfully turned a blind eye to the claims and interests of the Kurds in their eagerness to work together with them against IS?
To be honest, I think the deal was very clear from the beginning. Ironically, a Kurdish friend recently told me that he never understands why the PKK and the PYD, like the anti-imperialist Kurds in this region, are so critical of the United States and are so critical of like international Western interventionism. But at the same time, once the CIA knocks at their door, they feel very flattered to cooperate with Washington. I think the deal was very clear from the beginning. It provided a unique opportunity. By the way, I don't agree with what Eva said, that this is just a charade of the PKK exploiting the situation in Syria to strengthen their position in Turkey. I think this movement, this Rojava project in the northeast of Syria,
Rojava meaning the autonomously governed areas,
3 cantons that are under their control. It really provided an opportunity, and also it changed the reality, and in a way also it changed the ideology in a certain way. There was an opportunity to somehow prove themselves in a non-declared state, statelet, and that is important. Let's not forget, the idea of a national state is actually nothing that the PKK is in favor of. When they talk about federalism, on the other hand, they don't mean federalism inside Syria, to have like an autonomous region in a federal Syria.
They mean confederalism.
They mean federalism or confederalism, and they talk about all the Kurds in the Middle East. They're spread out in different neighboring countries. Nevertheless, this opportunity, they sought the opportunity and they proved themselves. Now, if you say the emergence of another state or a non-declared statelet of Kurdish autonomy is something useful or not, is going to further destabilize the region, I think in an environment where states collapse and fail, every project of self-administration and every project of, let's say, efficient administration that does one thing, which provides security to its citizens or provides security to the people on the ground and somehow improving their conditions of living, is already a big achievement. And therefore I understand that for a moment the US also, not only for the lack of alternatives, just said, like, let's leave out the terrorism debate here. Let's see who is performing on the ground. Let's see who we can partner with for a moment. The Europeans were very critical, by the way, about all the weapons, like very, very sophisticated weaponry that was funneled into the Kurdish areas by the Americans. But it was a strategic choice out of a lack of many alternatives. And I totally understand this. On the other hand, I also understand that the Turkish government is not at all happy with what's happening there. But the situation and the vacuum, it helped also to create. So they should not wonder that this project emerged.
Dilek Kurban, could one say that by arming and strengthening and training the YPG militia, the U.S. essentially set up the Kurds in northern Syria for this offensive by Turkey?
Well, I mean, when you look at history and, go back a couple of decades and remember what happened in Iraqi Kurdistan, right, after the Gulf War, it was pretty much the same scenario, because there are also Kurds in Iraq, and the U.S. at the time armed and supported the Iraqi Kurds, which had deeply alarmed the Turkish state at the time. Turkey was very upset, again, sort of talked about terrorism threat, etc. Over time, Turkey's policies have changed. Now the Turkish state at the moment has good relations with the Barzani regime, Barzani is the leader of the Iraqi Kurds, and now is opposing the Kurdish autonomy in Syria. I think we need to, when we're talking about Turkey and Turkey's policies, in order to understand what's going on, we need to sort of remember history and put all of this in a historical context. And just remember that from its foundation, from the foundation of the Turkish Republic. One of the sort of red lines of the official ideology in Turkey has been to ensure that the Kurds everywhere, including in Turkey, did not have autonomy and self-rule in any way, be it a state, be it a sort of autonomy in Turkey, federalism, confederalism, whatnot. The fight has always been there. In some cases, the Turkish state has lost in Iraqi Kurdistan. In some cases, well, the fight is going on in Turkey, and now there's Syria, right? So they want to make sure, the state wants to make sure that they do not allow what has happened in Iraqi Kurdistan to happen also in Syria. But from the perspective of the Kurds in Turkey, and I'm talking about the Kurds in general, right? We're talking about millions of people. This is yet another instance of a nationalist policy of the Turkish state, which doesn't want to accept the Kurdish identity as a distinct identity, and the Kurds as people who are also entitled to enjoy their fundamental rights, being in Turkey, Syria, or Iraq.
Eva Savelsberg, our question there at the end of the report was whether the Kurds have been betrayed. What do you think they are expecting from the United States, for example? It is sending very, very mixed signals so far. We're told, at least by Turkey, that the U.S. is now saying it is not going to continue to arm the YPG. What do you think people in northern Syria are expecting, and will they get it?
Well, first of all, I think we can say that the YPG has been betrayed by the United States, but not the Kurds. Because this would say that everybody identifies with the YPG, and this is definitely not the case in Syrian Kurdistan. We shouldn't really forget that. I mean, I do not think that the YPG is that popular as a lot of people think, indeed. And that's quite clear. I mean, you said they proved themselves in Syria. I think that's a difficult phrase. I mean, what did they prove? They did prove that they do not respect human rights. Huh? They do not respect it in Syrian Kurdistan as they do not respect it in Turkey or anyway. If you look, for example, what they did to the Syrian Kurdish opposition in Syrian Kurdistan, all those parties belonging to the Syrian National Council, for example, they closed all their offices. I mean, those offices simply don't exist anymore. There is no freedom of press in Syrian Kurdistan ruled by the YPG.
Welcome to the Middle East.
So, yeah, but it's important to say this, I think, because everybody's pretending that the situation is much better in Syrian Kurdistan than it is elsewhere. And it is not, indeed. A lot of Kurds who are not supporting the YPG tell you, well, our situation here is more difficult than under Assad now. The YPG has killed more oppositional politicians than the Assad regime ever did, and I think we shouldn't forget this and not focus so much on
that
stability.
Last statement is totally unsubstantiated, and I'm sorry if you say that, then you probably really lack the knowledge of what the Assad regime has done to the opposition over many decades.
We're talking about the Syrian Kurds.
We're talking about the regional context of the Syrian Kurds. I totally agree that the PYD, that organization, is not only a creation of the PKK, but it's also somehow an emulation in its methods of the Assad regime, because that's where it was bred, that's where it was grown. That's where it sought refuge during the times when it was oppressed and persecuted in Turkey, and the Assad regime supported them. But nevertheless, if you look at the regional context and you know what's going on in the region, then the performance of the YPG, I'm not talking about human rights, I'm talking about our notion of stability and Western notion of stability. They did. In this very difficult context, they did prove themselves. They showed that they can be efficient, and so did the Syrian Democratic Forces.
Middle Eastern stability, we like so much.
Absolutely.
We have very little time left on the clock, and I would like to talk a bit about where we're going from here and who might be able to exercise influence. Daniel Gerlach, if the U.S. were willing to use it, would it have political leverage vis-a-vis the YPG or the PYD in order perhaps to get some kind of a renunciation of claims that are troubling Turkey and thereby pacify the situation?
Yeah. I think the U.S. has very little political leverage at the moment and that's the result also of a strategic choice. I think what they can do now is exert the pressure they have on the YPG to keep a low profile, to withdraw to two of the cantons to give up Afrin, basically, to withdraw to two cantons in the east, and to somehow try to preserve and defend what they have, and then pressure Turkey to stay away from further interference here. But then we have to also reckon with the Russians. We have to put the Russians into the equations, because this rift between the US and Turkey is a strategic goal, in my view, and also a strategic asset for the Russians. That's why the Russians are not interested in somehow easing the situation, but they are interested in further escalation between these two powers. And I think, yes, the YPG knows that this is somehow, it can fall victim to this, but it knew this from the very beginning. All this conflict has been announced, and the operations of Turkey have been announced before, so nobody can say he was taken by surprise.
I'm afraid we're out of time. Many thanks to all of you for being with us today, and thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. See you soon.